Whenever there are video games that were based on books or on something that wasn't a video game, something kind of sad starts to happen over time. Knights of the Old Republic was one of the best entries in the entire Star Wars franchise, and for a video game, the storyline of Knights of the Old Republic was actually one of the best, most layered, and most three-dimensional stories in the entire Star Wars franchise to this day. Bloodlines might have been the best thing that ever happened to the World of Darkness franchise, and in terms of writing, the actual story Bloodlines followed was actually leaps and bounds better than half the garbage White Wolf ever published for that franchise, period. I recently did a video about Hogwarts Legacy, and Legacy is probably the best thing that's happened to the entire Harry Potter franchise in years. But no matter how good the writing and the storytelling and the game design is, there's always going to be this overall idea that there's something inherently bad about that game because it's a video game. There's this almost silently accepted preconceived notion that there has to be something inherently lesser and inferior about the artistic quality and the writing behind that game. And not everyone likes video games, there's nothing wrong with that. But for some reason, this divide between the original and the video game always brings the most pretentious, pathetic, and laughable people imaginable to the table around the originals. These unintelligent narcissists who do everything they can to try and talk down to and belittle fans of the video games, pretending that somehow liking them or that people who like them are beneath them somehow. Also, they can act like reading the books about a bunch of magic kids at a magic school, or watching movies about space wizards with laser swords, or playing tabletop games where you pretend to be a vampire instead is somehow an actual life accomplishment. You see this sometimes with games like KOTOR or Bloodlines or Hogwarts Legacy or something, and it's hilarious that people like this don't realize this is the same exact small-minded, short-sighted, idiotic attitude other people have about those books or those movies or those tabletop games in the first place. The same people they've probably complained about who'd laugh at them and call them losers for even touching these franchises at all in the first place. And in both cases, it's the same exact mentally stunted stupidity all around. Just this desperate narcissism that's incredibly unintelligent and incredibly shallow. And this was the same insufferable nonsense you used to see whenever you looked up The Witcher after people started reading the books because the Netflix show came out. The Witcher games were what brought that franchise actual global success. They were so successful they finally got people outside Europe into The Witcher. The Witcher 3 particularly was so successful, even people in countries like China or Japan were falling in love with The Witcher. And this was why they made the Netflix series in the first place. But as soon as people found out there were books behind the franchise, you immediately started seeing the same shameless frauds you always see looking for any excuse to pat themselves on the back, saying the same exact things. Doing everything they could to rub it in people's faces that the games were just glorified fanfiction so they could try and act as if liking them or the people who played them were somehow beneath them. And what was so ridiculous with The Witcher was that a lot of these people who were saying and writing these things in perfect English were probably lying. The Witcher books were written in Polish all the way back in the 90s, but they never translated them to English until the first game came out almost 20 years later, and even then there was very little demand for them with English reading audiences. They only did the first two and left the rest of them untranslated for years. We only saw more and more people reading the English versions after the games got more and more popular, and then again later when the Netflix show came out. So most of these people who cared enough to talk about the games in the first place but didn't know how to read Polish or Russian or German only read the books because they enjoyed the games. Or they watched the Netflix series and then read the books because they enjoyed the games. But out of nowhere, because Witcher was suddenly mainstream and they wanted to pretend like they were more cultured or like they were a part of the real Witcher, they suddenly didn't like the games anymore. Or worse, they never even played the games and didn't know anything about them, but still wanted to go around telling people they were bad because they watched a Netflix show and just started reading the books. And don't get me wrong, I like the games and the books, but if you legitimately just didn't like what the games did with the story, that's perfectly fine. And with The Witcher, we know the games weren't canon. The author outright said he didn't consider the games canon and that only the books he wrote were a part of the original story. But the people who did all this still just show how incredibly pathetic and laughable this whole mentality really is. Even just saying those games were bad because they're just fan fiction out of some petty spitefulness actually shows how pretentious and shallow these people were. Because yeah, those games weren't canon. But are we really ignoring the fact that the author of the books sold the rights to make them? That he made money off of them, and he told the developers what they could do with them? A lot of people might not know that, but when they started making and writing those games, Sapkowski actually sat down with them and laid out what they could do with his material. He told them Geralt was still alive and that they were allowed to bring him back as the main character in the first place. So first off, even though they're not canon, there are clearly major differences between an adaptation and fan fiction you or I could write all by ourselves. But more importantly, how do the games not being canon make them any less enjoyable? But because people like this are so stunted and so childish and so desperate to pretend they're better than other people, some of them will blatantly make things up. They'll pretend we shouldn't like something because it's somehow less than, as if liking it would make them less cultured or less valid, like we're all still in the 5th grade and we still have to pretend we like the right things to try and be cool. Meanwhile, this whole superiority complex revolves around the fact that they like the books while other people like video games about a guy who fights monsters and has sex with witches. About the same exact thing, just done in a different way.